YouTube is announcing plans to remove thousands of videos and channels that promote hate speech. The online platform says they will remove videos that advocate white supremacy and other bigoted ideologies. The move may result in thousands of videos and channels being removed from the site altogether. The company began enforcing its policy this week, but admits it could take months before all the content is removed. Online companies have come under intense criticism for their delayed reaction to the spread of hateful and false content. The policy also comes as a broader debate unfolds over whether social media companies are responsible for hate speech posted to their platforms. And with that, let's bring in this week's tech panel. Heidi Tvorek is an assistant professor of international history at the University of British Columbia. Hello to you, Heidi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And Heidi studies media, democracy, and digital economy. And Stephanie McClellan is a senior research associate with the Center for International Governance Innovation, and she focuses on cybersecurity, digital rights, and online disinformation. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so Heidi, we'll start with you. And what did you make of this announcement by YouTube this week?
I'm pleased that it's happened, but it's come really quite too late. And the big question that I have is really exactly what you pointed to at the beginning, which is how is this going to be enforced and how long is this going to take? And those are questions that I think need to be answered a little quicker than months and months.
Stephanie, what do you think about that? A lot of people have questions about the enforcement process of policies like this. Do you think that's going to be extraordinarily challenging for this platform?
Absolutely. We've seen already with Facebook, because a month or two back, they made a similar announcement saying that they were going to ban white supremacism from their platform. And we've seen some of the groups that they've kicked off been able to sort of evade these restrictions and get back on. So I think, they've had a hard enough problem enacting their existing terms of service, which is supposed to regulate how people use the platform. So I think, enforcement is always the tricky thing when you're dealing with hundreds of hours uploaded every minute.
Now, it's no question that, of course, they've been sort of deliberating these challenges, really, when it comes to regulating their platforms for some time, because this debate has been going on for a considerable amount of time, too. So, Heidi, I'm wondering whether or not there was a catalyst for them to actually start taking action itself. Was there a single action, or was it the fact that there was these other social media platforms that were also moving to ban or police certain accounts?
So there have been the long-term factors, just the fact that many democratic and other governments have become interested in regulating platforms. But the shorter-term factor was, I think, the Christchurch tragedy that happened, and a very recent call a few weeks ago that was signed by governments and platforms in Paris called the Christchurch Call, which asked for platforms and governments to do more to fight hate. So I think that was one of the proximate causes for why YouTube was releasing this announcement this week.
And in terms of YouTube, they also specifically say that they're moving to prevent users who violate their rules the ability to earn money from their work. So here's a bit of what they had to say in a blog post earlier this week. They said this, that channels that repeatedly brush up against our hate speech policies will be suspended from the YouTube Partner Program, meaning they can't run ads or their channel or use other monetization features like Snapchat. So maybe you walk us through what impact that might have on the platform, because so many people, Stephanie, will go to you, so many people do use this as really their source of income.
Yeah, and YouTube's been, using this sort of technique for a while to try and discourage people from posting this kind of content. And it was sort of an in-between measure rather than banning it outright. They were able to say, okay, well, they would disincentivize it by saying, taking away their reason for doing this. And again, that it's had mixed effectiveness because people who aren't able to monetize their videos or aren't able to have ads on their videos can still direct people to their websites where they're selling some of this merchandise. So it doesn't take away the problem entirely.
Does it then, Heidi, perhaps at the very least, set a good precedence? Because we know that there are these other platforms where the policing has not occurred in such a strict manner, or it hasn't been introduced in a strict manner. So I'm wondering whether or not this will set a good example, or whether these other websites, or there's a whole bunch of other host sites where you can post videos, whether or not they will just continue with the status quo.
Yeah, and it's a big question because there are also, as Stephanie said, ways that you can combine YouTube with other fundraising platforms, like, for example, GoFundMe, and we've seen examples of that in Canada. But even beyond that, there really is the question of whether YouTube's actions will match its words. So will they, for example, do this for very, very popular YouTube figures? There's one example recently in the US just last week of someone who's very popular, who's producing homophobic slurs, and the question is whether that person will have this policy enforced against them. So I think we really need to look to YouTube's actions, particularly against people who might be very popular on their platform, and see if they do what they say they're going to do.
But I guess the question also becomes, Stephanie, whether or not this starts encroaching on censorship, whether people's freedom of expression is being hindered because of these policies that are being put in place. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it is a legitimate concern, especially when you consider things that might be, we would probably to a certain extent, trust some governments or some platforms to get rid of this kind of speech that we can all agree is harmful. But if you look at other contexts, in a lot of cases, a government might say something is harmful or damaging when it's actually something they don't agree with. So there is a danger of course. I think in this case it's being used a little bit as people are using it as an excuse to let them say whatever they want. And even in our laws right now in Canada, and even in the United States, which is very liberal when it comes to freedom of expression, there are always limits to freedom of expression. So I think when there are things that especially if companies like YouTube decide that they want to be a public source of information, there are things that they can do to stop to follow existing laws when it comes to harming people, threatening people, targeting people with hate speech based on their ethnicity or their sexual orientation. There are things like that I think we can start with before getting into these more complicated issues of what sort of speech should be banned outright.
And I guess final question I wanted to ask you, Heidi, is in the sense that we know that these are such huge platforms, widely used by millions of people. So perhaps the platforms need more help when it comes to implementing these policies. We know that you testified before the House of Commons Justice Committee on the spread of online hate and extremism last week, in fact. And you mentioned that online platform companies can't solve these problems alone. So what do you think is the sort of collective solution, perhaps?
So any solution is going to have to be like a stool with three legs. It's platforms, it's government, but it's also civil society. And one of the things that government can do is ensure that civil society, like groups representing marginalized people, journalists, et cetera, have enough support to actually be able to report on these things, and that platforms listen to them. Most of the times when we see platforms taking action, it's really because journalists and others have uncovered some of the times that they're not enforcing their own policies, for example. So that's something that I've asked government to bear in mind, is that civil society matters here too, and really trying to figure out whether platforms are keeping to the policies they've created for themselves, even before we go further in thinking about regulation.